Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here. We will get started in just a minute. Thank you and welcome everyone. I see that folks are still trickling in, but I want to make sure that we get this show on the road so we can make sure our panelists who all have very busy day jobs are able to get back to their lives. So welcome today for today's media briefing. We're so excited that you're here to listen to this exciting panel of speakers talk about this development in the Minnesota Fight for Fair Maps. So you kind of know what the run of show is going to look like. You'll hear brief opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then we will open the call to reporter questions. If you have questions, you can ask them two ways. You can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also, when it comes that time, raise your hand if you would like to ask a question verbally, and I will allow you to unmute. When you ask your questions, please identify your name and media outlet, and if there is a panelist who you would prefer the question to be addressed to. This briefing is being recorded, and we will send you a link following this call. I know some of you prefer to take your own video and audio, so you may also do that. That is not a problem at all. Finally, I will introduce each speaker with their name, title, and organization, and I'm also going to pop that information in the chat just to make sure that you can get the spelling and affiliation correct. It is now my pleasure to introduce our Executive Director for Common Cause Minnesota, Anastasia Belladonna Carrera, who will kick us off today. Anastasia?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the members of the press, and thank you to everyone attending this morning's briefing. As Susana mentioned, my name is Anastasia Belladonna Carrera, and I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Minnesota. So Common Cause is a nonpartisan grassroots organization dedicated to upholding the core values of our American democracy. Voting and elections are at the very heart and soul of our democracy. And that's why today, along with 7 other plaintiffs, we are so proudly filing, or have filed, a historic lawsuit in the Minnesota Supreme Court to ensure that Black, Indigenous, Minnesotans of color, and other disenfranchised Minnesotans are included in this year's redistricting process. Our lawsuit includes a broad cross-section of organizations and individuals working with and representing communities and Minnesotans of color. Now, redistricting is one of the most important issues facing our state this year. It's really too important to protect, or rather, it's really too important not to actually protect the rights of Black, Indigenous, and Minnesotans of color, along with other disenfranchised Minnesotans who may call our state home. So redistricting affects where we vote, who is on our ballot for the next decade. Every Minnesotan should have a chance to participate in this important democratic process, no matter what is their zip code, what is their race or ethnicity, how much they make, or the political party that they belong to. For far too long, Black, Indigenous, and Minnesotans of color have had their political power diluted in the redistricting process. As a result, many do not benefit from equitable electoral power or a fair opportunity to elect candidates with shared interests who are going to take up those issues that are maybe unique to these communities and push them through the legislature or in local government. As with the national trend, collectively, people of color represent the fastest growing population in Minnesota. So currently, 21.4% of Minnesotans are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, compared to 16.8 in 2010 and only 11.8 in 2000. So Black, Indigenous, and communities of color are projected to represent almost 27% in the next 10 years. That's almost a third of the population. Historically and today, the economic interests of these communities are not adequately represented in the Minnesota legislature or even in some local governments. During a time in our country when legislators across the nation, and even right here in Minnesota, are introducing legislation to suppress the right to vote, adequate representation for Black, Indigenous, and Minnesotans of color is critically important. I cannot stress that enough. I am so very proud that our historic lawsuit, the fifth file to date regarding districting, is the first to focus solely on the representation of communities and Minnesotans of color. I am also so grateful to be joined today by our attorney, Brian Dillon, who will provide the legal perspective on today's lawsuit. And I'm also joined by some of the other co-plaintiffs who will speak to the importance of this lawsuit and why, more importantly, they have joined. After each individual presents, as Susana mentioned, we look forward to answering any of your questions. And again, thank you for being here and covering this historic moment. Suzanne.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. At this point, I am going to toss it to Brian Dillon, who is a partner with Lothrop GPM LLP. Brian?
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, Anastasia. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Brian Dillon. I am a partner at the law firm of Lathrop GPM, and I'm proud to say that I am the lead attorney for Common Cause Minnesota, OneMinnesota.org, Voices for Racial Justice, and the individual plaintiffs in our coalition, including Ida Simon, who you'll hear from later, who are seeking to intervene and participate as parties in the redistricting lawsuit that is going on here in Minnesota. I would like to provide just a little bit of context on the lawsuit, its current status, and the role our coalition of plaintiffs is seeking to play. Under Minnesota law, every 10 years after the new census data is released, the Minnesota State Legislature is charged with passing a bill that draws new congressional and state legislative boundaries that equalize population counts between districts and satisfy other constitutional requirements. But for many decades, our politically divided legislature has not been able to meet that charge. And so as a backstop, under our state's law, the task of drawing these new boundaries is left to the courts, and specifically to a panel of judges, a five-member panel of judges appointed by the Chief Justice of our state Supreme Court. A few weeks ago, Chief Justice Lori Gilday appointed 5 judges to serve on this special redistricting panel. And the panel is charged now not only with drawing the new state and federal district boundaries based on the 2020 census data, but also to hear any challenges to the validity of the new boundaries that that panel might draw. And by statute, these new boundaries must be adopted on or before February 15th of 2022. So it's going to be a busy next several months, and as this process unfolds, the panel will has not yet issued orders that clearly articulate sort of how the process will unfold, deadlines for various filings and things like that. But we know that by February 15 of 2022, come hell or high water, these boundaries need to be drawn. To date, there are 3 other groups of plaintiffs in addition to our group that have filed court actions seeking to be heard on these redistricting issues. These other groups identify as either Republicans, Democrats, or redistricting specialists. None of them identify as Black, Indigenous, or Minnesotans of color, or seek to advocate or advance the interests of these types of these communities in this process. So in the lawsuit that we filed today, our group is asking the special redistricting panel to give communities of color in Minnesota a seat at the table. We want the right to participate as parties in the lawsuit, just like these other groups of plaintiffs, so that the rights and interests of Black, Indigenous, and other Minnesotans of color are separately represented and heard in the process by which these new boundaries, which will be with us for the next 10 years, are drawn. And as Anastasia mentioned, our lawsuit is the only one to focus on the interests of Minnesota's communities of color, as opposed to partisan, political, or other interests. In redistricting lawsuits like these, Minnesota courts have continually recognized that participation by those with a diverse set of interests and a stake in the outcome is critically important. And we couldn't agree more. And at this moment in Minnesota's history, it is even more important than ever that Black, Indigenous, and all Minnesotans of color be separately represented and allowed to participate as parties in the redistricting proceeding. And it's our sincere hope that our participation will better inform the process and result in political districts throughout the state that accurately reflect Minnesota's entire and increasingly diverse population, so that everyone can feel like they have an equal say in our representative democracy. So with that, I will turn it back to Suzanne, and I think Brett Buckner is up next.
Thank you so much, Brian. And that is correct. Our next speaker is Brett Buckner, Managing Director of OneMinnesota.org.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Brian. Again, my name is Brett Buckner, Managing Director for OneMN.org, one of the organizational plaintiffs in today's lawsuit. We are a multi-ethnic coalition dedicated to advocating and engaging Minnesotans in the nonpartisan policy manners that improve the life for everyone in our state. We seek to help empower communities to advocate for positive change, and the key policy change is to empower our vote at the ballot box. That's why we're so pleased to join Common Cause Minnesota, our other plaintiff organizations and individuals in filing this lawsuit today. We've long been involved in redistricting. Since 2000, we advocated for the state to protect BIPOC communities in the redistricting process. Having been in the space for many years, we understand that redistricting will determine if every community in Minnesota will have the power to hold our leaders accountable, if we have free and fair elections, and of course, who we will vote for at the congressional, state, and local levels over the next 10 years. Far too long, Minnesota has been deprived of a fair redistricting process. Again, this is the 6th time that we have not had the legislature take care of the process. We want lines that represent everyone. We believe right now that this is a great opportunity to get it right for every Minnesotan, to ensure that we all have equal voice in our government, no matter who they are or where they come from. With a democracy where everyone is represented and has a voice to advocate for themselves, their families, their communities, and for the state as a whole, and then it benefits everybody. We hope our state judicial leaders, drawing our new political lines, hear our voices loud and clear during this process. Thank you again for the time, and Suzanne, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Brett. Our next speaker is Monica Hurtado, a community organizer with Voices for Racial Justice. Monica, take it away.
Thank you, everybody. My name is Monica Maria Hurtado. I am a community organizer with Voices for Racial Justice and a proud plaintiff in this redistricting lawsuit. Voices for Racial Justice is a nonprofit organization dedicated to building power for all Minnesotans, especially within the Black, Indigenous, and communities of color in the state. At Voices, we want a Minnesota where we all can successfully advocate for ourselves and our families, and where we all can have equal access to democracy and to continue building our collective power. And that is why we were very involved with the census work, and very proud that thanks to the work of people of color in the state and Indigenous and Black members of the community, we kept the 8 congressional district seats. And this is why we are at Voices strongly are very in support of this lawsuit, and excited to be part of all efforts to ensure that Black, Indigenous, and Minnesotans of color rights are honored. We strongly believe that we need to build a democracy where everyone feels the need to participate, where every vote is counted, and where everyone's voice is heard. We strongly believe that people from all walks of life should be able to run for and get to office, and not just the wealthy, the well-connected, and the historically privileged. We defend that every eligible Minnesotan has the right to vote for better working conditions, stronger schools, and racial justice. We believe in a democracy where your political power will not depend on where you live, the color of your skin, your first language, or how much money you make. We believe in a democracy where political power belongs to all of us. And all of this means that we all will have a voice and many seats at the table, and that we all will secure a better future for all of us and our communities and our families. This is why we feel that drawing maps, which include the interests of BIPOC communities, will support all of us to get closer to that Minnesota that we all deserve. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Our final speaker is Ida Simon, who is one of the individual plaintiffs in this lawsuit. Ida, the floor is yours. I am so sorry. You look like you're still muted.
I was muted. Thank you. Let us show gratitude to the ground we stand on and to the indigenous people of Dakota and Sioux who cared for this land and soil for thousands of years and whose history and knowledge oftentimes goes unrecognized. Let us not forget the sacrifice made by African Americans for hundreds of years that allowed me to be here in front of you all today. We owe it to the generation of oppressed people to not only acknowledge them, but also to continue to advocate for all our marginalized communities. Good morning. My name is Ida Simon. I am a proud mother of three, a community organizer, a resident of Worthington for more than 2 decades, and a plaintiff in this lawsuit. You have heard from legal expert and several organizations about this lawsuit, but I want to share my perspective as a mother, a voter, and a civically engaged member of this community. For many, redistricting is just a policy issue. For me and for my family, it's very personal. Greater Minnesota is such a beautiful place for its geography, agricultural lands, and growing cultural diversity. I love this community and I'm proud to be raising my family here. I care about the future of my community, not just for me, but for my children. Last year, I decided to run for city council. I ran to give voice to many of our neighbors and friends who often felt like they had no place in our democracy or didn't know how to advocate for the things that matter the most. Stronger schools, good paying jobs, and quality healthcare. I was excited by the opportunity to make a difference for my community and to be an example for my kids on how to show up and play an active role in our democracy. Worthington is in Nobles County, Minnesota, with other 3 women of color. I tried to make history. If either of us had won any of our races, it would have been the first time a person of color had been elected to local statewide office in Nobles County. I was excited to help create a more authentic democracy, but sadly, we all lost. Now we have the opportunity to use the redistricting to really change this. Less than half of Worthington residents are white. Latinos are the largest demographic, with Blacks and Asians also growing. In the 80s, Worthington's economy was on the brink of crisis, and it was our immigrant population that saved us. It was our communities that are investing in our schools, growing the tax base, and making our state work. And still, 4 women of color could not get elected. I'm more determined now than ever to work for new maps that will make it possible to see a person of color elected in our district. Because of the way democracy works in our state, Black, Indigenous, Minnesotans of color don't have strong voice, even though we're the fastest growing demographic group and we're driving our economy. As a result, we struggle to play a more active role in our communities. But my story is just one example. There are countless stories like mine across the state, and it's time for change. And that's why it's important to me to be part of this work. Our democracy is stronger when everyone participates, and that means having maps to ensure Black, Indigenous, and Minnesotans of color have a seat at the table where decisions are being made. With everyone, where everyone can have a voice, regardless of what you look like or where you come from. That's what our democracy is all about, and I look forward to ensuring all our children and grandchildren can have an equal say in our government. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ida, and thank you to all of our panelists. We would now like to open it up to questions. We do see that there are a couple of folks who have raised their hands, and I'll call on you shortly. Again, there are two ways to ask. You can put your question in the Q&A, or you can put your question in or raise your hand, and I will ask you to unmute. Once you unmute, we ask that you please identify your name, your outlet, and if there is a particular panelist that you would like to address your question. One note for the good of the order, Brett Buckner, unfortunately, has a commitment coming right on the heels of this one. So if anyone has a question for Brett, please ask it on the front end of this because I know he has to run. All right, and with that, I see that there is a question from Mike Moen. Mike, I'm gonna hit the allow to talk button for you.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my question. With this filing and with the court in which you're doing, is there a legal precedent here from either Minnesota or another state, and I'm sorry if you already brought this up, that you can really turn to that might elevate your case or that you're using as an argument?
So that's probably a good one for me, Mike. Thank you. You know, the first stage here is to be recognized as a party in the lawsuit with the right to participate. There is, and I, in my opening remarks, I commented that in the redistricting process, back in 2010, and I believe back in the 2000 process as well. I mean, our state Supreme Court has recognized the importance of allowing diverse groups of parties to or of organizations to participate as parties in this process. And, you know, we've got groups of plaintiffs already that are politically motivated, right? I mean, they self-identify as Republican or Democratic leaning. We've got another group that sort of self-identifies as redistricting aficionados, and that's what they call themselves. And they are, you know, they've been through this process before, right? Our group is the only one that identifies as, you know, Black, Indigenous, or persons of color, or organizations who've got a, you know, long track record of amplifying the voices of those communities. And so I don't know how you can promote the interest of wanting diverse voices in this process, people who have a stake at the table, without allowing a group like ours to participate as a party. So, I mean, I think hopefully that answers your question, but I'm hopeful and I'm confident that that our petition to intervene in this lawsuit will be granted, and we'll see where we go from there.
I just had one follow-up question for Ida about your story and your experience. Can you sort of expand on just a little bit about how the current process has really hindered your ability to get elected and for other candidates of color?
Ida, you're muted.
I'm sorry. I would definitely say that it has hindered, but I am not an expert in when it comes to redistricting and mapping. So I would really prefer that you ask that question to the experts in the panel. Thank you.
Great. Oh, go ahead, Anastasia.
Yeah, sorry. I can actually give a little bit of context to how it is that areas such as Nobles County and Worthington, how districting happens in a way that dilutes communities of color and other special interest groups, or not groups, but communities of interest. One of the ways, two key ways that it's done is through cracking or packing, right? So cracking is when you have, for example, you have an area that has a high level of communities of color. I'm just going to use that example. High numbers or population of emerging communities of color. I think Worthington is an area that we can no longer call emerging, in the sense that it's been there for a hot minute, and so have communities of color. I mean, now they're actually the majority. I think it's the only area outside of the metro where there's such a high number of individuals of color and indigenous people living in that area. What happens is that when you're structuring local redistricting, oftentimes these communities are divided and split up in such a way that even though they have the majority of a specific geographic area, the way the wards or precincts or local districts are, or areas are shaped or divided, or the lines are shifted and moved, it dilutes their representation, right? So that's the cracking. The packing piece could be an area where you have the same scenario, but they hyperly concentrate communities of color and indigenous people into one or two local districts, like a ward or precinct, what have you. And then instead of having what could truly be represented as, say, 5 out of 10 wards or precincts, they get 3 or 2 because they're so packed into those areas. And all of this, as you see, starts from the top down, right? So first you have to establish your congressional district lines. Then you go into your state district lines. Once those are established, they get reported in February to local governments, and then they start their redistricting process, right? And so that's the part where candidates such as Aida, in her situation, is likely to be impacted more so than not. School board areas are also another place where you see a lot of this happening as well.
Thank you for taking my questions.
Thank you, Anastasia. Our next questioner is Alberta Gillespie. Alberta, I'm going to allow you to talk now. You're going to have to unmute yourself.
I am sorry, I did not have a question, so I must have hit the button by mistake.
Not a problem. We're glad you're here. And then our looks like the last question that we have in the queue is Logan Carroll. Logan, do you have a question? Great. Looks like Logan's going to put his question in the chat. We'll just give him a second. While we are waiting for that, let's see, there is a question from Brianna. Give me just a second. My apologies. This is from Brianna Birschbach with the Star Tribune. My question is, how hard and fast the February deadline to have completed maps? The whole process has been delayed. Is it possible the state could get pushed back as well? Anastasia or Brian, do one of you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'm going to let Brian take the legal part of it, but I'm going to answer part of the legal question on it, which I think is more of the practical context to that question. That's a great question, and I actually get that a lot.
Yeah.
So here, go ahead, Brian.
You go. If you want to go first, go ahead. I mean, it's a great question to which I think the real answer is good question. I don't have the answer to that, right? I mean, we're in uncharted waters here with the delay on the census data, which has really compressed sort of the whole redistricting process this year. The legislature, during its regular session didn't even have the data, right, for much of the session. And so, the February 15 deadline is set in stone in the sense that that's what the statutes require. And that deadline is there because you sort of work back from the general election. Before the general election, you need to have a primary. And before the primary, you need to have a filing deadline, a date by which, candidates who want to put themselves out there, have to file their papers. And prior to that, these candidates need to know, what district am I running in, right? What would my constituency be? And until those lines are drawn, it's challenging, unfair, probably impossible for a candidate to make a decision on, whether they want to run or not, and because they don't know what district they're going to represent. So it's a very good question. Again, I'll bring it back to where I started. We're in uncharted waters here, given the compression of the schedule caused by the pandemic and the delay in the release of the census data. I think the timing on all of this and how the special redistricting panel does its work, my assumption, my guess is that the panel is going to do everything in its power to create a schedule that will allow us to meet that deadline, with intermediate deadlines along the way as the process unfolds, and we'll be very transparent, I think, in sort of what that timeline is going to look like, not only for the parties who are actively seeking to participate in the process, like ours, but also for the general public. If history is a guide, I anticipate there will be public meetings throughout the state where any member of the public can appear and have their voice be heard on what their thoughts are on redistricting. And so that's going to be built into the process as well. So more to come. I think that the panel, one of its first orders of business will probably be to establish the schedule by which it intends to do its work. And I think my suspicion is that the end date there will be that February 15 deadline that is required by statute.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to Brian's overview, which I thought was excellent and on point, is that on the community grassroots site of everything that Brian just talked about, I think that the Special Redistricting Commission is actually going to do exactly what Brian just said. But the question is, how authentic and how meaningful is that public participation going to be? And how is that going to impact the communities or the public, right, in general, who are going to want to engage in that process? And so that deadline is a statutory deadline. I know that there is some question in law about, in the Constitution, there's reference to the census information, but there's not like a specific line that says that they must rely on that. And historically, the court has not used information outside of, to my knowledge, the census data to be able to move forward with that. So it really just depends on how robust a process the court's going to want to put in place with regards to allowing for public engagement. But at the end of the day, the court can do whatever the court wants to do, because there is nothing in statute that provides the court with any kind of, say, guardrails, right, that they are held accountable to, except to say, well, what happened 10 years ago or 10 years before that? And an example of that was that, I believe it was in the 2000 cycle, they held 6 public hearings. In the 2010 cycle, they did 4 public hearings. Why they went from 6 to 4, who was left out because they went from 6 to 4, what was the process or assessment they went through? Nobody knows, and they don't tell you. So this is part of that real sort of meaty part of this whole process that is oftentimes lost on communities, particularly disenfranchised communities, because unlike us, they don't stay up till 2, 3 in the morning listening to oral arguments on the House and Senate chamber. They don't, wonk and track, right, what the court has done in the past. All they feel are those secondary ripples from all these decisions being made by courts that don't have the role to represent constituents. That's pretty explosive. You have a body that is drawing lines, that have political and policy implications to the people living in it and are not accountable. They do not represent constituents. That is supposed to be the legislative body. So that Brianna, to your point, it's very multi-layered in the complication, and I think your question really highlights exactly why we brought the historic lawsuit this morning, because not only are there implications for a specific growing emerging population in the state of Minnesota not considered in the process, but even the process is a little, and my colleagues, went wackadoodle, in a way, in the way that it really isn't even clearly laid out. It is so fluid, and there really isn't any type of accountability in, do you hold 6 hearings? Do you hold full hearings? So really, Brianna, they can roll with whatever they want by February 15th. I think your question though goes to the significance of that February 15th rather date to communities, I think, right? And the practical sense of what Brian laid out is that the court can roll in whatever way they want, really, and make that deadline regardless. But the real question is, what impact does something like that have, and who is going to be disparately impacted by that?
Great. Thank you, Anastasia. So we have Logan Carroll's question from the chat. It says the Hoffeller files clearly show how working in the margins of redistricting can disenfranchise BIPOC communities. Obviously, you want wonks at the table who can represent BIPOC communities, but this makes it difficult for the community to directly represent themselves. So how does your lawsuit bridge the divide between the communities and the wonks? And I am going to steal that phrasing because I think that's a great question. Who wants to take a crack at that?
Brian, did you want to start, and then maybe I can jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer to that question is probably, I wish Brett was here. Brett is probably, of our coalition members, he's probably the most knowledgeable about sort of the mapping work that our coalition is already sort of working on now, and the efforts our coalition is making to get input, anecdotal input and statistical and objective input that helps to bridge the divide that I think Logan is describing. You know, we want to ensure and do the best we can to make sure that the lines that are drawn reflect the diversity of the communities, and that our elected officials reflect the diversity of the communities that they represent. And how we bridge the divide between communities and wonks is a very good question, to which I'm sure there are many, many good answers, and I don't have all of them. But I can tell you we're going to work really hard to try. And that's really sort of the critical thing that our group is trying to accomplish, is to make sure that not only our individual plaintiffs and the members of our coalition, but the organizational members of our coalition, Common Cause, Voices for Racial Justice, OneMinnesota.org, that is, I mean, bridging that divide is what they exist to do, right? And the constituencies that they serve and their networks we're going to be tapping those as best we can to bridge the very divide that Logan describes.
Thank you so much, Brian. Monica, did you want to jump in here?
Yes, I just want to say this. I'm not expert on litigation, and I'm learning tons as we go with the process. But I will say this: the census process made our organization, Voices for Racial Justice, to be very involved, even though we were very skeptical to be part of that effort. And when we understood what was at stake, we jumped, and not only us, many organizations led by people of color and indigenous in the state. And I will say, thanks to that effort and other people, we were able to keep our 8 congressional districts, as I was saying in my remarks. That same process is informing, educating us on the importance of redistricting and mapping, and how it's in our self-interest as people of color, indigenous, and Black, so like to be as engaged as possible. So it's work in progress. Tons of education is happening, but aside from the litigation process, there are tons of community listening sessions happening around this topic, because we want to see ourselves at the center of this conversation. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Anastasia, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I actually wanted to respond to how our lawsuit specifically bridges the divide between communities and the wonks. And this is why our lawsuit is so historic and so important. We're not just filing a lawsuit that says, please let us be at the table. We're also utilizing groups and other activists who are busy right now, as we sit here, hosting some of the forums that Monica talked about, the community of interest workshops. And through that process, communities actually engaging in drawing their community of interest maps. And then what's going to happen is that as they get together and start forming their unity maps and start shaping what their districts look like from a fair and equitable representation that's not politically driven in the sense that they're moving a party agenda or a special interest agenda, they're driving a we the people agenda, right? They want to make sure that districts are functioning for the human beings within them, because redistricting is not just about counting. It's not just about saying 500 here in District A and 500 here in District B. It's about one person, one vote, and everyone's voice being relevant within that district. So they have an opportunity of voting in and electing a candidate that best represents their values and their interests. And by using what's happening right now across the state and everyday people engaging and drawing their own community of interest, we're going to be moving forward maps that equitably and fairly represent Minnesotans, period. Not just Minnesotans of color, because this isn't about, you know, as some people might phrase it, you know, someone just wants something for nothing, or someone wants an unfair advantage. We're not talking about an unfair advantage. We're talking about being equal at a table of power, right? We're talking about being as heard as everybody else in that process. So our lawsuit isn't just about philosophically or theoretically saying, let us be at the table. It is about coming also and showing through maps that we're going to be presenting, that we're going to be arguing off of, speaking about redistricting people, principles that put people ahead of parties, right? It's more than just a symbolic move that we're doing. That's what makes it historic. We're demonstrating that you can draw fair, equitable maps where people, all Minnesotans, because we're Minnesotans before we're anything else, are equitably represented within that space. And so to Logan's point, that's what our lawsuit, that's how our lawsuit is bridging wonkness with, right, the lawsuit and access and community, right? Communities are already doing this work, you guys. As we sit here right now, they're already having their workshops, they're already busy drawing these maps. We're the vehicle to make sure that those maps get before these spaces of power and are equally and equitably considered. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I am not, let me see, I'm not seeing any additional questions and no additional raised hands. If you all have questions later on, you can contact Katie Scally, and I will put her contact information in the chat. We will be sending out a link to today's recording along with links to updated filings. So you have all of those at your fingertips. Thank you again so much for attending, and thank you to all of our amazing panelists and for all of the amazing work that we've done to get to this part and this point in this historic lawsuit. So this is, let me drop Katie's email in the chat, and I will let you all go for the day. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.